Elena Kovacs' earliest memories were not of lullabies or nursery rhymes, but of the metallic roar of jet engines splitting the sky. Her childhood unfolded on the edges of military airfields where her father, Major Istvan Kovacs, served as a fighter pilot. Other children in the neighborhood drew houses with chimneys and trees. Elena drew silhouettes of aircraft F-16s, MiG-29s, and the sharp outlines of wings cutting through clouds. The scent of jet fuel was to her the perfume of belonging. Her father rarely spoke about war in the language of glory. He spoke instead of responsibility. When he tucked her into bed, his voice carried the steady cadence of discipline. "The sky is never conquered, Elena. It only lends you passage," he would say, reminding her that every flight was a dialogue with danger. She listened with the solemnity of a child too young to grasp mortality, but old enough to sense weight in her father's words. His flight jacket always smelled faintly of leather and fuel, a scent that seemed to anchor him to a world both noble and perilous. Her mother tried in vain to introduce a softer rhythm to their home life. There were classical piano lessons, ballet shoes with fraying ribbons, and evenings of candlelight to chase away the hardness of the bass. But Elena's heart tilted toward the hangars, where steel giants slumbered until awakened by men in helmets and flight suits. She was not content to sit behind glass windows. She pressed her face against chain-link fences, watching her father disappear into the sky, always wondering if he would return. The cycle of absence and return became the architecture of her childhood, teaching her patience and resilience before she knew the meaning of the words. At school, her classmates whispered about her father with awe. To them, he was a hero wrapped in the romance of speed and danger. To Elena, he was both larger than life and achingly fragile. She saw the lines deepen around his eyes after each deployment, the way his hands sometimes trembled when he thought no one was looking. She carried those details in silence, storing them as truths about what service really meant. One evening, after a long deployment, her father took her to the edge of the runway, just as the sun bled into the horizon. He placed a pair of heavy aviation headphones over her ears and let her listen to the tower's clipped communications, a secret language of codes and numbers. "This is not about being stronger than anyone else," he told her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "It's about being steady when everything around you shakes." That moment etched itself into her bones, not as inspiration, but as instruction. By the time she turned 16, Elena had internalized a rhythm foreign to most teenagers. Her mornings were marked by runs before dawn, her afternoons by disciplined study, her evenings by writing in a leather-bound journal her father had given her. In its pages, she recorded not only the details of her days, but also the quiet vow she made to herself. She would not live in the shadow of her father's wings. She would build her own. The noise of engines, once the backdrop of her childhood, became the pulse of her identity. While her peers dreamt of stages, offices, or families, Elena's dreams were of barracks, ranges, and missions, yet unnamed. Her father never discouraged her, but neither did he push her. He simply reminded her over and over that the path she longed for would test her more than she could imagine. "Steel is not born hard," he told her once. "It is made so in fire." When he said it, Elena thought only of the heat of engines and the glow of sunsets over runways. Years later, she would come to understand he had been speaking of her. The day Elena Kovacs raised her right hand and swore her oath to the United States Navy, the air was sharp with the scent of salt from the Pacific. The ceremony was brief, practical, without grandeur, but for Elena it felt as though the weight of her entire childhood had crystallized into that single moment. Her voice did not tremble. She spoke each word as if fastening it to her bones. When the oath concluded, there was no applause, only the sound of boots shuffling against concrete, but she felt a quiet surge of triumph. She had crossed a threshold from dream to reality. Her decision to enlist was not greeted with the same solemn pride by everyone around her. The whisper began almost immediately, quiet at first, then sharper like static growing louder on a radio. She was not just another recruit. She was the anomaly. A woman with ambitions not to settle into logistics communications or medical support, but to stand shoulder to shoulder with men in the most grueling branch of all naval special warfare. The name SEALs alone carried with it the aura of impossible trials, a fraternity forged in salt water, sleepless nights, and bone-deep scars. That Elena would aspire to it seemed to many not only bold, but delusional. She overheard the comments in the mess hall, caught the smirks during drills, and sometimes the outright questions that carried an edge of ridicule. "You really think you can make it past the first phase?" one recruit asked her after a long day of physical conditioning. His tone was not curious, but amused. She did not answer. She had already learned that silence could cut sharper than retorts. The instructors were no kinder. Though the official regulations allowed women to apply the culture, was a fortress not easily breached. One chief petty officer looked at her file, then at her, and shook his head slowly. "You'll want to think carefully before you ruin yourself here," he told her. "This isn't about equality. This is about survival." His words were meant as warning, but Elena absorbed them like fuel. She had not come to beg acceptance. She had come to endure. At night, when the barracks settled into uneasy quiet, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying her father's words, "Steel is made in fire." This, she realized, would be her forge. Every scoff, every doubt, every look of disbelief was a spark against her skin. She did not allow herself to imagine glory or the satisfaction of proving anyone wrong. She imagined only the next step, the next drill, the next test. Survival, as the chief had said. But hers would not be survival alone. It would be a claim to space that no one could take from her. The first weeks were a blur of exhaustion. Dawn runs with sand weighting her shoes, endless push-ups, until her arms gave out the relentless bark of orders from instructors whose eyes seemed designed to search for weakness. Elena pushed through each day with a calm surface, though her body screamed in rebellion. The ache was constant, but pain was familiar to her, almost comforting. She carried it like an old companion. What unsettled the others most was not her presence, but her refusal to falter where they expected it. When the surf drills began, waves crashing and pulling recruits under until they coughed salt water, Elena emerged with her face set in grim stillness. She did not shiver or whine. She did not look for sympathy. Instead, she fixed her gaze on the horizon, as if she belonged there, among the shifting line between sea and sky. It was then the whispers changed. They did not vanish, but they took on a new edge, no longer only doubt, but unease. The men who mocked her began to watch her with narrowed eyes, measuring her resolve against their own. She was not stronger, she was not faster, but she was still there, and that in the unforgiving world of naval special warfare was the first test that mattered. By the end of the first month, Elena understood she had become more than just another recruit. She was a question mark stamped onto the institution itself, forcing the base to confront whether a woman could survive the crucible of becoming a SEAL. It was not glory she sought, but the right to stand in that crucible without apology. And when she laced her boots each morning, tightening the leather until it bit into her ankles, she did not think of the men who doubted her. She thought of the engines of her childhood roaring against gravity, climbing into skies no one owned. From the first weeks of training, Elena learned that silence carried its own weight. It was not just the silence of the instructors watching for hesitation, or the silence of exhaustion that fell over the barracks at night. It was the silence that followed her whenever she entered a room. The pause in conversation, the shift of shoulders, the quick glances exchanged between men who could not fathom why she was there. The contempt did not always come in words. Sometimes it was in the way they adjusted their stances when she walked past, broadening their shoulders, as though to remind her of the physical scale she would never match. Sometimes it was in the laughter that burst out in corners of the gym, not aimed directly at her, but timed perfectly after she finished a set, daring her to believe it was coincidence. When the words did come, they were sharper than the edges of the obstacles they climbed. "Hey, Kovacs, the SEALs don't issue kitchen aprons, you know that, right?" one recruit muttered during a gear check, loud enough for the others to laugh. Another added, "You'll make it past the swim drills, sure, but maybe only as a lifeguard." The laughter was raw, unchecked, the kind that carried the arrogance of a majority. Elena never laughed with them, never gave them the satisfaction of anger. She tied her laces, checked her rifle, and moved on. But contempt was not confined to peers. Even the instructors whose duty was to train and harden carried doubt in their eyes. Chief Harrington, a man with years of combat behind him and a scar running from his jaw to his collar, studied her as if she were a crack in the system rather than a student. He did not shout at her more than the others. His weapon was subtler. A raised eyebrow when she completed a drill. A clipped, "Not bad for you." The quiet insinuation that her achievements belonged in a smaller category, one that would never measure against the men. That gaze cut deeper than the recruits' jokes. She could laugh at boys who still needed to prove themselves, but the eyes of seasoned warriors carried something heavier, the judgment of experience. Harrington had seen men broken by the training men who had come with muscles carved from stone and wills like iron, and he did not believe Elena belonged among them. His doubt more than the jeers set fire in her chest. During physical trials when others grunted and cursed, Elena focused on the rhythm of breath and motion. Her body ached no less than theirs, but she refused to let them see weakness. If her legs trembled after long runs, she steadied them before standing in formation. If her arms screamed during pull-ups, she swallowed the pain and completed each repetition without letting her jaw clench. She knew eyes were on her, always measuring, always expecting the slip, the fall, the moment they could confirm what they believed from the start. In the chow hall, conversations dropped when she carried her tray. Sometimes someone would slide an empty seat away, not enough to be open hostility, just enough to remind her she was unwelcome. She ate quickly with the same steady silence, retreating to her bunk, with the journal her father had given her. In its pages, she wrote not about them but about herself, about the war she was waging against the quiet erosion of doubt. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of obstacle courses and ocean swims, Harrington called her aside. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "You're strong, Kovacs, but strength isn't enough here. You need more than lungs and legs. You need to decide if humiliation is something you can survive, because it won't end. Not here, not even if you pass." His eyes held no malice, only certainty. It was not meant as cruelty. It was in his mind honesty. Elena met his gaze without flinching. She did not argue, did not defend herself with words. She simply nodded and returned to formation. Inside, though, the words curled around her resolve like barbed wire. She understood then that this was not just a battle of endurance or skill. It was a battle for belonging, and no accomplishment would ever come without the shadow of that question, did she deserve to be there? As the weeks passed, the contempt of her peers became almost predictable. She stopped hearing the words and began reading the patterns, the way some men laughed the loudest when they were failing, the way others mocked her to mask their own fatigue. She learned that disdain was another kind of weakness, a shield raised against what they could not control. And slowly, quietly, she sharpened her silence into armor. Every step, every breath, every repetition became less about proving them wrong and more about proving herself right. The first official tests came like waves, relentless and unyielding. They were designed not just to measure strength or stamina, but to strip recruits down to the raw core of who they were. The instructors spoke of them not as challenges, but as revelations, moments when the mask of determination would crack, revealing whether there was anything beneath it worth forging into steel. For Elena, the opening trial was a timed run across soft sand. It looked simple from a distance, a measured stretch of beach boots sinking into shifting ground, wind cutting against the lungs. But within minutes, the sand swallowed energy like a living thing. Recruits cursed, stumbled spat salt from the air as the tide pushed higher. Elena's legs burned with the weight of each step. By the halfway mark, a voice inside her whispered what so many around her already believed, that she was not meant for this. She silenced it with the memory of engines roaring into sky, with the image of her father standing steady against wind. She did not finish first, but she did not falter, and when she crossed the line, her breath came ragged, but her eyes were calm. The next test was the obstacle course, a labyrinth of rope climbs, wall scrambles, and log carries that turned minutes into eternity. For every wall she scaled, she felt the weight of doubting eyes on her back. The logs were heavier in her arms than in the arms of her male peers, and the instructors made sure she carried her share without excuse. Splinters dug into her palms. Sweat ran into her eyes. More than once her grip slipped, and each time laughter rose around her like smoke. She tightened her jaw and climbed again. By the end, her arms trembled, but she refused to look down or ask for relief. When she finally dropped to the sand at the finish, her body ached as if she had been torn apart, but her silence denied them the spectacle they had waited for. Water came next, the infamous swim drills that had broken men stronger than she. The ocean was not kind. Its waves crashed with indifference, dragging recruits under filling lungs with salt and fear. Elena fought through each stroke, her body shuddering in cold that pierced bone. She surfaced again and again, refusing to surrender, even as the current battered her. Others cursed the water, some shouted at the instructors, but Elena made no sound. Her silence, once mocked, began to unsettle those who expected her collapse. She gave the ocean no victory. Perhaps the most punishing of all was the log PT, when teams of recruits lifted massive wooden beams above their heads, chanting through strain as the weight ground shoulders raw. Elena was placed in the middle, where her strength would be tested most mercilessly. The log pressed down her arms, shook, and for a moment her knees bent under the burden. The men on either side sneered, waiting for the collapse. Instead, she straightened, locked her arms, and bore the weight as though her will alone anchored the wood above her. Time blurred, reduced to pain and grit, until finally the command was given to lower the log. When it crashed to the sand, Elena staggered, but she did not fall. Each trial left marks. Bruises spread across her arms, blisters opened on her feet, salt rash burned her skin. At night, in the quiet of the barracks, she tended to her wounds with steady hands. She did not complain. She did not write of suffering in her journal. She wrote only of survival, each line a testament that she had endured another day. The instructors noted her persistence with cool detachment. "She's still here," Harrington muttered one morning, as if the fact itself defied logic. Among her peers, resentment deepened. Some began to loathe her not for failing, but for refusing to fail where they expected it. Her presence became an unspoken challenge. If she could endure, what excuse did they have for quitting? Elena never allowed herself to savor the small victories. Each test was only a doorway to the next, each survival only permission to face greater hardship. She knew the true trials had not yet begun. Still in the dim light before dawn, lacing her boots with fingers raw and swollen, she allowed herself one quiet truth. She had not come this far to be broken by anyone's laughter. She would not give them that. The ocean at night was a different creature. In daylight, it was merciless but knowable. Under the cover of darkness, it became an abyss without end. The recruits were herded down to the shoreline just after dusk, wetsuits clinging to skin oxygen tanks, heavy on their backs. The instructors gave minimal instruction. "Stay with your partner. Complete the course. Surface only when ordered." Their voices were flat, indifferent, as if sending men and women into black water was no different than a morning jog. Elena adjusted her mask, checked her gear, and stepped into the surf. The cold bit instantly piercing through the suit and into her bones. Her partner, A broad-shouldered recruit from Texas named McLean muttered a curse as the first wave broke over them. Elena said nothing. She had long since learned that words offered no warmth. When the signal came, they descended. The surface closed above her like a lid, and the world narrowed to the hiss of air through her regulator and the thundering of her own heartbeat. Darkness surrounded them so completely that even the glow sticks tied to the instructor's line seemed to vanish in the shifting current. Her body moved through liquid shadow, each kick measured each breath, a reminder that oxygen was finite and fragile. Minutes stretched into eternity. The water pressed against her chest, heavy and insistent. At 30 feet, the cold deepened an icy grip that coiled around her ribs. She tightened her jaw and followed the faint line ahead, the cord that tethered them all to direction. Somewhere behind McLean's light flickered, then steadied. Elena resisted the urge to turn. Looking back was wasted energy. The first task came equipment checks, underwater masks removed, and replaced regulators exchanged. Simple drills in daylight, cruel tests in the dark. When Elena pulled her mask away, salt stung her eyes, and for a moment she was blind in true blackness. She forced the mask back on, expelled the water with a sharp exhale, and found the line again. Her lungs screamed for air, panic clawing at the edges of her mind. She silenced it, clung to rhythm, breathe in, breathe out. The current shifted suddenly, dragging them sideways. The line stretched taut in her hand, vibrating with the struggle of others ahead. Her grip nearly slipped. For an instant, the thought came surface breath escape. Her vision blurred, a thin haze of dizziness clouding her focus. She clenched her teeth, forcing her muscles to obey when her body begged to quit. She imagined her father's voice, steady and low. It's about being steady when everything shakes. Her chest tightened. She felt the creeping fog of hypoxia, the edges of consciousness beginning to fray. She wanted air, wanted light, wanted to tear free from the ocean's grip. But she fixed her eyes on the faint shimmer of a glow stick ahead, a fragment of promise in the dark. She kicked, harder, drew one more breath from the regulator, then another until the dizziness receded just enough to hold her. The signal to surface came like salvation. She followed the others upward, the darkness lightening into shadow, then into the faint shimmer of moonlit water. When her head broke the surface, the night air was sharp in her lungs, painful in its sweetness. She tore the regulator from her mouth and coughed, every muscle trembling from the strain. On the beach, the recruits staggered out of the surf, collapsing into the sand, their bodies shaking uncontrollably. Elena sank to her knees, arms heavy vision, still unsteady. Around her, some men cursed the ocean, some spat salt and swore they had nearly drowned. No one spoke to her, but their silence was heavier than words. She had been expected to fail there, swallowed by darkness and cold. Chief Harrington passed among them, his flashlight beam sweeping over wet faces. When it landed on Elena, it paused for a beat longer than the others. His expression was unreadable, but the silence was its own acknowledgement. She was still there, still breathing, despite the ocean's attempt to break her. That night in her bunk, Elena lay awake long after the others had succumbed to exhaustion. Her body ached with the memory of the dive, her chest still raw from the battle against her own lungs. She closed her eyes and saw again the black expanse of water, endless and merciless. But beneath it all, she also remembered the moment she had chosen not to rise, not to surrender, but to endure. In that decision, she knew was the shape of who she was becoming. Isolation arrived not as a sudden wound, but as a slow tightening like a rope drawn invisibly around Elena's world. In the barracks, laughter passed over her, as though she were a ghost. Recruits huddled in groups after drills, sharing jokes or complaints. But the circles closed when she approached, shoulders shifting just enough to remind her she did not belong. At meals, the clatter of trays and the smell of reheated rations filled the mess hall, but the seats around her often remained empty, a quiet choreography no one had to discuss aloud. She grew accustomed to eating quickly, eyes fixed on her plate, the hum of conversation surrounding her, but never including her. It was not hostility so much as erasure. They did not argue with her presence. They ignored it, and in many ways that was harder. Even contempt acknowledged existence. Silence erased it. During training, partners were assigned for drills, but those who drew her name sighed audibly, some muttering under their breath about being saddled with dead weight. She responded not with retorts, but with effort, carrying her side of the log, running her miles, swimming her lengths. Still, when the drills ended, the distance remained. The others gathered in 2s and 3s, comparing blisters or joking about instructors. Elena laced her boots alone, rolled her shoulders against fatigue, alone returned to the barracks with no one at her side. At night, when the lights dimmed and the low murmur of voices lingered between bunks, she opened her journal. Its leather cover, worn now by salt and sand, was the only confidant that never judged. Her pen scratched across the page in neat, disciplined strokes, recording not only the trials of the day, but the emptiness between them. She wrote of the long silences at meals, of the weight of eyes that looked past her, rather than at her, of the ache in her chest, that no amount of push-ups or running could cure. She did not write to complain. She wrote to survive, to give shape to a loneliness that might otherwise consume her. There were moments fleeting and unbidden when the solitude nearly broke her. She would hear laughter ripple through the barracks, muffled by walls, and feel its absence like a wound. In those moments, her mind drifted to her father's words about steadiness, about fire forging steel. But even steel, she thought, needed the presence of others to give it purpose. What was the point of enduring if endurance was met only with emptiness? And yet she rose each morning before dawn. She tied her boots with the same precision, carried her rifle, with the same discipline, pushed her body through drills with the same relentless drive. If no one would speak to her, she would let her actions speak for her. If no one would share her burden, she would carry it alone. Still, in the quietest hours, when the journal lay open in her hands, she admitted truths even she would not say aloud. The loneliness was not weakness. It was hunger. A hunger for acknowledgement, for belonging, for someone, anyone to see her not as an intrusion, but as a fellow soldier. She wrote those words, then underlined them once, as though engraving them deeper into the page. The next day, she tucked the journal beneath her pillow, laced her boots, and walked into formation with her eyes forward. No one greeted her. No one noticed the faint swelling of her fingers from writing late into the night. But the silence she carried was no longer hollow. It was something she had named, something she had claimed, and in that naming, it became bearable. Loneliness would not break her. It would become another weight she learned to carry, as familiar as the rifle on her shoulder, as constant as the ocean's pull. The morning air was dry and sharp, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of gun oil and sand. Rows of rifles lay across wooden tables under a canopy, each one marked with its own kind of authority. The compact M4 carbines, the heavier Mach 48 machine guns, the long-bodied M110 sniper systems that seemed to stretch toward the horizon. The recruits stood in formation, restless, shifting their weight, as the instructors laid out the day's purpose. Accuracy, they reminded them, was the currency of survival. Speed without precision was meaningless. When her name was called, Elena stepped forward with the others. She had fired rifles before standard-issue weapons in training familiar tools of the trade. But today the range was set for longer distances, the kind where precision was measured not in inches, but in fractions. The murmurs began before she even touched the weapon. "She won't manage the recoil. Sniper rifles aren't made for small shoulders." The comments drifted like smoke, never addressed directly to her, but meant to settle in her ears. Elena ignored them. She moved with deliberate calm, selected the M110 from the rack, and checked it piece by piece. Bolt chamber magazine. She ran her hand along the weapon as if memorizing its edges, then carried it to the firing line. The targets stood 600 yards away, black silhouettes swaying faintly in the desert heat. Elena lowered herself onto the mat, the rifle heavy against her shoulder, the bipod sinking slightly into the sand. She inhaled slowly, letting the air expand her lungs, then exhaled until the world narrowed to the scope's circle. Through the glass, the target shimmered a ghost distorted by heat. Her finger rested on the trigger. She did not rush. Around her, other recruits fired quickly rounds, snapping through the air, brass clattering onto the mats. She waited heart steady, remembering her father's words about steadiness when everything shook. The world outside the scope fell away. She felt only the rise of her breath, the weight of the rifle, the stillness of her body aligning with steel. She squeezed. The crack tore through the air, followed by a second of silence before the spotter called out, "Hit!" The word was almost surprised. Elena adjusted, chambered another round, exhaled and fired again. Hit! The rhythm grew steady. Breathe, fire, chamber fire, each shot landing within inches of the last. While others struggled against recoil or cursed the wind, Elena's grouping tightened into a pattern that could not be dismissed as luck. By the time her magazine emptied, a quiet had fallen around her station. Not silence exactly, but the absence of ridicule. Instructors exchanged quick glances. Chief Harrington, arms crossed at the edge of the range, tilted his head slightly as though recalibrating what he thought he knew. He did not smile, but he did not look away. Elena rolled onto her side, cleared the weapon, and laid it on the mat with care. Sweat darkened her collar, and her arms ached faintly from holding the rifle so steady. But her expression was unchanged. She rose without triumph, without acknowledgement, as though she had done nothing more than complete another drill. The whispers followed, though their tone had shifted. No one congratulated her, but the edge of laughter had dulled. Some recruits avoided her gaze, altogether unsettled, not by her presence, but by the skill they had witnessed. Others stole glances, the beginnings of reluctant recognition flickering in their eyes. That night, as she opened her journal, Elena did not write about the shots themselves. She wrote about the silence afterward, the moment when words failed her critics, when the only truth left was the one written on the distant steel of the targets. For the first time, the isolation she carried felt less like exile and more like armor. Precision, she realized, was its own kind of language, and on the range she had spoken it fluently. The sun bore down relentlessly on the training field, turning the packed dirt into a shimmering haze. It was a day designed to break them. An obstacle course stretched across the length of the base, filled with barbed wire, crawls, wall climbs, rope traverses, and timed sprints that pushed bodies to the point of collapse. Sweat ran into eyes, boots kicked up dust, and every breath felt scraped raw by grit. The instructors stood along the perimeter, clipboards in hand, eyes sharp, searching for weakness. Elena moved through the course with steady determination, pacing herself rather than chasing speed. She had learned that conserving breath and calculating each motion mattered more than empty bravado. The men around her hurled themselves at obstacles with raw strength, some vaulting walls with a roar, others cursing as they slipped on ropes. She kept quiet, arms burning, lungs protesting, but her focus unbroken. Midway through the course, a commotion erupted ahead. A recruit named Donovan, broad-shouldered, loud-mouthed, one of her most vocal critics, had reached the rope climb, but faltered halfway up. His movements grew frantic, his grip slipping as his boots scrabbled for purchase. Shouts went up as he lost hold and fell hard onto the ground. The impact knocked the air out of him, and for a moment he lay still, chest heaving, shallowly, eyes wide with shock. The instructors did not move. Their rule was brutal: finish the course, complete the trial, or fail. Assistance was not encouraged, not expected. But Elena's instincts overrode protocol. She broke from the line without hesitation, sprinting toward Donovan. Dust kicked up under her boots as she dropped to her knees beside him. His breathing was ragged panic overtaking strength. She pressed her hand against his shoulder, urging him to stay still, scanning quickly for injury. "You're fine, breathe," she told him, her voice low but firm. She grabbed his arm and hauled him to his knees, ignoring the sharp sting in her own muscles. Donovan tried to push her away, pride flickering even in weakness, but his arms trembled too violently. Elena took his weight across her back, securing his arm over her shoulder, and half-carried, half-dragged him toward the medical tent at the edge of the field. The others watched in silence. Some smirked at Donovan's collapse. Others exchanged looks of disbelief that she, of all people, was the one pulling him up. Chief Harrington's expression was unreadable, though his jaw tightened as he tracked their movement. By the time Elena laid Donovan down before the corpseman, her chest was heaving, sweat streaking her temples. The corpsman took over checking pulse and airway, nodding at her with the faintest flicker of respect. But when she turned back toward the line, the silence that greeted her was colder than before. No applause, no acknowledgement. Just the same hardened stares, the same dismissal, as though what she had done was an indulgence, a waste of time. Donovan, embarrassed, avoided her eyes, muttering something about catching his breath to preserve whatever pride he could salvage. Elena returned to the course alone, dust clinging to her sweat-soaked uniform arms, burning from the weight she had carried. She completed the obstacles with no fanfare, her legs heavy, but her will steady. By the time she crossed the final line, the instructors scribbled notes, but offered nothing more. That night in her journal, she wrote only a single line: "To save a man's life is not enough to prove mine has worth." The page absorbed her words, stark and unadorned. She closed the notebook slowly, knowing that the silence of her peers was louder than any insult. She had acted on instinct, on principle, and it had left her no closer to belonging. Yet beneath the sting of rejection, something steadier took root. Recognition was not hers to ask for, and respect, if it ever came, would not be given lightly. For now she carried the knowledge that when a moment of consequence came, she had not hesitated. That truth, though unspoken, was hers to keep. The humiliation came during morning drills, when the entire unit was assembled in neat formation under the rising sun. The air was thick with salt from the nearby ocean boots, lined in perfect rows, rifles slung against shoulders. Chief Harrington paced in front of them, barking orders with the gravel in his voice that seemed to carry more weight than the rifles themselves. When the cadence stopped, his gaze landed squarely on Elena. He had singled her out before, but this time there was something sharper in his eyes, a deliberate intent. "Kovacs," he called, voice cutting across the silence. "Step forward!" She obeyed, stepping into the open, the heat of 100 eyes pressing against her back. She kept her spine-straight boots aligned, though her chest already ached with the knowledge of what was coming. Harrington circled her slowly, his hands clasped behind him. "You think you belong here?" he asked, voice carrying to every ear in the formation. "You think this is a place for you because you managed to drag a half-conscious man across a field?" He stopped abruptly and pointed at her, his finger an accusation. "This is not a hospital. This is war. And you Kovacs are dead weight." A ripple of low laughter stirred among the ranks, some of the men unable to hide their smirks. Others looked straight ahead, faces rigid, unwilling to be caught reacting. The shame that swept over her felt heavier than any rucksack, more suffocating than any dive. Harrington didn't stop. "Men, take a good look. This is what weakness looks like. Fragile, misplaced. The Navy's charity project." His voice cut deeper than any insult she had endured in private. Every word seemed to carve itself into her skin. Elena swallowed hard, her throat tight, but her expression didn't break. She stood rigid, forcing her gaze ahead, as if the horizon could swallow her whole. Inside, however, a crack spread wider than she wanted to admit. Doubt seeped in with every syllable. Maybe they were right. Maybe her presence here was not defiance, but foolishness. The laughter faded as the unit was dismissed, boots scattering over gravel. She remained frozen in place for a moment longer before turning to retrieve her gear. The men passed her without a word, some with lingering glances of disdain, others with the studied indifference that stung more than mockery. That night in her quarters, she sat on the edge of the narrow cot, hands trembling as she opened her journal. Her pen hovered above the page, but no words came. The humiliation was too raw to translate into sentences, the sting of his voice still echoing in her skull. She closed the notebook without writing a single word. For the first time since arriving at training, Elena considered leaving. The thought sat heavy in her chest, walking away, abandoning this impossible climb, escaping the constant scorn. She imagined packing her bag, boarding a bus out of the base, and fading into anonymity. The temptation almost felt like relief. But as the barracks fell quiet, she lay back and stared at the steel beams above her. The memories of her father's voice returned calm and steady, telling her as a child that engines only soared because they endured pressure. She clenched her jaw, holding on to that thought like a lifeline. Sleep did not come easily. She closed her eyes against the weight of shame, whispering to herself in the dark, endure one more day. It was not triumph, it was survival, but it was enough to keep her there. The next morning broke gray and heavy clouds hanging low over the naval base, as if the sky itself mirrored the heaviness inside her. Elena pulled on her fatigues with practiced motions, but her hands moved slower than usual, the weight of Harrington's words still pressing against her ribs. The sting of public humiliation had not faded overnight. Instead, it lingered like salt on a wound, raw and relentless. She moved through the routine boots, laced hair tied back. Rifle checked each step. Automatic, mechanical. Yet her thoughts drifted elsewhere, away from the barracks and the drills, back to a quieter time, when the world seemed simpler, and her worth was not questioned every hour of every day. It was the memory of her father that rose unbidden, carried on the faint scent of jet fuel from the airstrip nearby. She was 10 years old again, standing beside him on the tarmac of an old airbase in Hungary, watching as he ran his gloved hands along the fuselage of a MiG fighter. His presence had always been steady, his voice calm, but never indulgent. He had been a man of discipline, forged by war and service, yet he spoke to her not as a soldier to a child, but as a teacher to a student of life. She remembered how she had asked him once, her voice small against the roar of engines, "Papa, do you think I could ever be a warrior?" He had crouched down to her level, his flight helmet tucked under one arm, his eyes steady and impossibly kind. "Elena," he had said, his Hungarian accent curling around the syllables, "a warrior is not born from muscle or strength. A warrior is born from will." He tapped a finger lightly against her chest. "From here. The body will fail, the mind will doubt, but if the will endures, you will be unbreakable." The memory settled into her bones like a balm. She could see the faint smile he had given her, the kind that was rare and therefore unforgettable. That was the day she had understood that her father saw something in her, not fragility, not weakness, but a spark worth protecting. As she stood now in the chill of morning, the echo of his words grew louder than Harrington's insults. She realized that she had been measuring herself against the sneers of men who barely knew her, rather than against the truth her father had instilled in her years ago. Muscles could tire. Endurance could falter. But will was the one thing no one could strip from her unless she surrendered it. During the day's drills, when her arms screamed from carrying gear and her lungs burned with exertion, she repeated his words silently, like a prayer, not muscle, will. Each step became less about proving herself to others, and more about honoring the man who had believed in her before she even knew how to believe in herself. That night she opened her journal again. This time the pen did not hesitate. In deliberate strokes she wrote, "A warrior is not born from muscle, but from will. Today I chose not to leave. Today I chose to endure. Papa would expect nothing less." The page trembled under her hand, but the words were steady. For the first time in days, she felt the smallest glimmer of strength return, not loud or defiant, but quiet and unyielding, the kind that could carry her forward. The days that followed bled into one another, each dawn arriving like a challenge flung down at her feet. Elena rose before the others, the barracks still thick with the breath of sleeping men, and laced her boots in silence. She trained alone in the gray margins of morning, pushing her body harder, faster, further. The salt air of the naval base burned in her lungs as she ran the perimeter with weights strapped across her chest. Blisters tore open on her palms from endless repetitions on the climbing rope, but she wrapped them in tape and went again. Every ache became fuel. Every scar a reminder of her choice to endure. Her instructors noticed the change. She no longer wavered under the weight of ridicule. She no longer flinched when pushed beyond reason. Harrington still barked at her, still found ways to single her out, but the sting had dulled. She heard her father's voice in every insult, a whisper of iron reminding her that her will was the only weapon that mattered. She carried that memory like an invisible standard, a banner no storm could tear away. At the shooting range, she stayed long after the others left, the last rays of light falling across her shoulders, as she refined her breathing, her trigger squeeze her stillness. She began to hit the mark with frightening consistency. The paper targets pierced precisely where she aimed, as if her focus itself could cut through the air. Sweat slicked her skin. Her muscles trembled, but she refused to stop until her body gave way. Her endurance training grew harsher. She would drag herself through the surf at night, the cold biting into her bones, waves crashing over her helmet as she crawled inch by inch across the sand. She forced herself into the pool for midnight swims, her chest screaming for air as she pushed past the point where her mind begged her to stop. Each time she surfaced, gasping and trembling, she felt a new layer of weakness peel away. What remained was lean, sharp, and unyielding. The others began to notice. Some muttered grudging respect when they thought she couldn't hear. Others avoided her altogether, unsettled by the relentlessness in her eyes. She no longer sought their approval. She was no longer fighting to belong. She was fighting to prove to herself that she could transcend every limitation placed upon her, whether by men, by rules, or by the frailty of her own body. Her journal reflected the transformation. The entries grew shorter, stripped of hesitation. Words like doubt and failure faded, replaced by resolve and endurance. On one page, written in bold strokes that pressed deep into the paper, she left a simple declaration, "I will not break." By the time the sun dipped below the horizon each evening, her body was a battlefield of exhaustion, but her spirit had found its rhythm. Pain no longer deterred her. It became a measure of progress, a signpost marking how far she had pushed beyond yesterday's limits. In those grueling hours, Elena Kovacs became something the base could not ignore. Not a woman struggling to survive among men, but a warrior forged in silence by sheer force of will. The announcement came with the sharp clarity of a challenge. The entire unit was to undergo the SEAL weapons proficiency test, a grueling evaluation that would separate the competent from the exceptional. Rows of weapons lay displayed beneath the morning sun. 4 carbines with optics gleaming, Mag-48 light machine guns, heavy with belts of ammunition, the M82 Barrett sniper rifle with its intimidating bulk, even the compact but deadly MP5s, favored for close quarters. Each weapon demanded mastery, not just brute strength, but precision, composure, and an instinct for survival. The men buzzed with anticipation, exchanging boasts, their voices laced with confidence that Elena would stumble. She heard the muttered bets, the quiet laughter that shadowed her steps. "Let's see her lift a Barrett," someone said with a sneer. She ignored them, her eyes scanning the arsenal. These weapons were not foreign to her. They were tools, extensions of discipline and focus. Still, the weight of expectation pressed against her chest. She was not being tested simply for accuracy, but for the right to exist among them. The first stage began with the M4. Firing prone, kneeling, standing targets shifted at unpredictable distances. Elena adjusted her breathing, letting the recoil settle into her shoulder, the scope aligning like a natural extension of her eye. Each shot cracked with rhythm paper silhouettes jerking under the precision of her fire. She rose smoothly, transitioning between stances, her movements controlled, deliberate. By the end of the magazine, her grouping was tighter than most. A few instructors exchanged glances, their pens hesitating mid-mark. Next came the machine gun. The Mag-48 sat heavy on its bipod, its weight a test of endurance more than accuracy. When her turn came, She shouldered the load with steady arms, feeding the belt through with practiced hands. The recoil thundered against her, shaking her frame, but she did not falter. Round after round, stitched across the target's bursts, controlled discipline, guiding each squeeze of the trigger. The barrel steamed, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. By the time she released the weapon, her arms trembled, but her gaze was steady. The whispers around her had grown quieter. Then came the Barrett, the weapon most had assumed would break her. Its sheer size seemed built to intimidate, its recoil notorious for punishing even seasoned operators. She lay prone, positioning the bipod into the earth, the rifle stretching long and heavy across her body. Elena closed her eyes for a breath, recalling the cadence of her father's words. A warrior is made in the will, not in the muscle. She exhaled, opened her eyes, and locked on to the target nearly 1,000 yards away. The shot thundered, a deep recoil reverberating through her bones. Dust lifted, silence followed, then the distant clang of steel confirmed her hit. She chambered another round, adjusted fractionally, and fired again. Another hit, and another. By the 5th shot, the range had grown utterly silent. The Barrett meant to humble her had instead become her instrument of defiance. When the drill ended, the men filed out in uneasy quiet. A few glanced at her with something closer to respect than disdain, though most held their tongues. The instructors noted their observations, masks unreadable, but Elena could see the shift in their eyes. She had not just passed the test, she had altered the air around her. That evening she sat on her bunk, sweat still drying on her skin, muscles aching from the day's strain. She opened her journal and wrote only one sentence. They thought the weapons would silence me. Instead, I silenced the doubt. The final echo of the Barrett's report faded into the open sky, leaving a strange, cavernous stillness across the range. Dust still lingered in the air, drifting in the shafts of sunlight. Yet no one moved. No one spoke. The men who had been so quick to jeer now stood with their arms slack at their sides, eyes fixed on Elena, as though uncertain whether they had truly seen what had just happened. The clang of steel targets in the distance was the only proof that her shots had landed with unerring precision. She rose slowly from the prone position, unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. Her fingers brushed the cold metal of the Barrett before she set it down gently, the gesture reverent rather than triumphant. Her breathing was steady, her face calm, betraying none of the storm she had endured to arrive at this moment. To her it was not about spectacle but survival, about proving, if only to herself, that she belonged here. An instructor scribbled a final note on his clipboard, his expression unreadable, but his hesitation spoke louder than words. Across the line, one of her fellow trainees swallowed hard, the swagger drained from his posture. Another avoided her gaze entirely. The silence was no longer the weight of contempt, but of disbelief. A silence that admitted, without anyone daring to speak, that something fundamental had shifted. For weeks she had been the shadow in their midst, the outsider, the anomaly, the one destined to fail. But in that quiet moment, surrounded by steel and dust, she was no longer invisible. Respect had not yet been offered, not openly, but the absence of ridicule was its own kind of recognition. Elena gathered her gear without a word. She did not smile, did not allow even a flicker of triumph to cross her face. This was not victory, not yet. It was only a pause, a silence she had earned through will and precision. As she walked back across the range, her boots grinding softly in the gravel, the men parted for her, wordless, the sound of her steps, the only voice in the air. That night, when the barracks had gone still, she sat at her desk with her journal open. She wrote with a firm hand, her script steady, despite the ache in her muscles. Sometimes the loudest answer is the silence that follows. Morning came with the usual cadence of boots on concrete and the distant thrum of helicopters warming on the tarmac. Yet something in the air felt altered. Elena sensed it the moment she entered the mess hall. Conversations quieted, not with derision this time, but with a muted awareness that her presence could no longer be brushed aside. Men who once laughed too loudly when she walked past now shifted uneasily, offering space at the table, though she still chose to sit alone. Respect had not bloomed into camaraderie, but the wall of contempt had cracked. Later that day, during the debrief in the steel-walled briefing room, the commanding officer addressed the unit with a clipped tone. His words were measured, but his eyes lingered on Elena longer than before. He spoke of performance under pressure, of discipline, of precision, with weapons that demanded absolute mastery. Without naming her, he acknowledged what the entire base had witnessed. And when his gaze finally settled fully upon her, there was no trace of doubt, only the reluctant concession of a man forced to see what he could no longer deny. The change was subtle at first. A nod from a fellow trainee who had once mocked her stance on the range. A hand offered during drills, not out of pity but as a gesture of solidarity. In the gym, when she pushed herself through weighted pull-ups until her arms trembled, no one scoffed. Instead, silence gave way to watchful respect. Her sweat and persistence had bought her something more valuable than applause. It had forced recognition. Yet Elena did not let it soften her. She knew recognition was fragile, easily withdrawn if she faltered even once. It was not friendship nor acceptance. It was the shifting of the tide, a cautious acknowledgement that she could no longer be dismissed. For her, it was enough. That night, lying on the narrow bunk, she let the fatigue of the day wash over her. The memory of her father's words returned about will shaping warriors more than muscle ever could. She understood them differently now. Recognition was not a gift bestowed. It was seized, earned inch by inch, until no one could look away. The sun was low over the training grounds, its last light washing the concrete and steel in shades of amber and blood orange. The day's drills had ended, the echoes of gunfire and shouted orders fading into silence. Elena stood for a moment longer at the edge of the range, her boots planted firmly in the dust, the heavy scent of gun oil and spent cartridges lingering around her. She didn't speak, didn't raise her chin in triumph, didn't demand recognition. She simply gathered her gear with steady hands, the calm of someone who no longer needed to prove anything to herself. As she walked toward the barracks, the men parted without a word. No jeers, no laughter, not even forced politeness, just silence, thick and heavy as if each of them carried the weight of what they had seen. Their eyes followed her, some reluctant, some contemplative, some quietly respectful. What she left behind in her wake was not applause, but something deeper, a presence that lingered long after she was gone. The gravel crunched softly under her boots as she crossed the yard. Beyond the wire fence, the horizon stretched endless, the sea glinting faintly in the distance. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a quiet breath of release. There would be more battles ahead within the base, within the system, perhaps within her own doubts. But in this moment, Elena Kovacs had carved her place with nothing but willpower and silence. She disappeared into the fading light, no slogans trailing after her, no banners to mark her defiance. Only the image of her solitary figure remained unbending, untamed, and unforgettable. It was enough to remind those who watched that strength did not always roar. Sometimes it simply walked away, leaving the ground forever changed.